Have you ever noticed how noisy your mind is? The constant chatter, the endless stream of thoughts, worries, plans, and memories that flow through your consciousness from the moment you wake up until you finally drift off to sleep. This mental noise has become so familiar that most of us barely notice it anymore. The background radiation of human existence. But what if I told you that beneath this cacophony of mental activity lies a profound silence? A vast stillness that holds secrets our busy minds can rarely access. This is the space where the soul speaks, where wisdom emerges not from thinking, but from being. It's a dimension of consciousness that those who have journeyed to the threshold of death and returned often describe as the most transformative aspect of their experience. When the mind goes silent, something else awakens. Something ancient and knowing. Something that feels more authentically you than the chattering voice you've identified with all your life. The experiences commonly known as near-death experiences, or NDEs, offer us a rare glimpse into what happens when the ordinary thinking mind temporarily steps aside. These remarkable accounts, gathered over decades of careful research, reveal a consistent pattern. In those moments when life hangs in the balance, when the brain's ordinary functioning is compromised, people often report a profound mental clarity, unlike anything they've known before. It's not that they stop having experiences, quite the opposite. Their experiences become more vivid, more real, more meaningful. But the constant narrative, the voice that typically narrates our lives moment by moment, falls away. And in that silence, something extraordinary happens. "It wasn't that I couldn't think," explained one woman who had clinically died for several minutes during a cardiac arrest. "It was that thinking as I had known it was replaced by something far more direct, more immediate. I didn't need to form thoughts into words. Understanding just was." This description echoes countless others who speak of a form of knowing that transcends our familiar mental processes. They describe it as more complete, more whole, as if our ordinary thinking actually filters and limits our understanding rather than facilitating it. This phenomenon raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness itself. What if our thinking minds, which we prize so highly in our culture, actually represent just one mode of knowing? A mode that's efficient for navigating the practical demands of physical existence but limited in its ability to comprehend larger reality. What if, beneath the surface of our thoughts, there exists a deeper form of awareness that connects us more directly to truth? The irony is that we've built an entire civilization around the cultivation of thought. Our educational systems, our workplaces, our technologies, all designed to enhance our capacity to think, analyze, calculate, and verbalize. We identify strongly with our thoughts, often believing that I am what I think. Yet the testimony of those who have glimpsed beyond the veil suggests something quite different. That our deepest identity, our most authentic self, emerges precisely when thinking subsides. Consider the common experience reported by those in the midst of life-threatening situations. The climber falling from a cliff, the driver in the seconds before a collision. Time seems to slow down. The mind's chatter falls away. A profound clarity emerges. In these moments of extremity, something shifts in consciousness. The narrating mind, with its constant commentary, temporarily surrenders to a more direct form of awareness. And interestingly, people often report that in these moments, they feel more fully themselves, more authentically present, than in ordinary states of consciousness. What's happening in these extraordinary moments? From a neurological perspective, extreme stress triggers massive changes in brain function. The default mode network, regions of the brain associated with self-referential thinking, mind-wandering, and the construction of our autobiographical narrative, may temporarily shut down. Meanwhile, other systems in the brain become hyperactive, creating states of heightened perception and awareness. But this neurological account, while valuable, doesn't fully address the subjective experience itself, the sense of encountering a deeper, more fundamental aspect of self when the thinking mind goes quiet. Those who study contemplative traditions recognize these accounts immediately. Across cultures and throughout history, spiritual practitioners have developed methods specifically designed to quiet the thinking mind. Meditation, contemplative prayer, sacred chanting, ritual movement. The goal isn't to stop awareness, but to shift into a different mode of consciousness, one where direct knowing can emerge from the silence. What near-death experiencers seem to encounter spontaneously is something very similar to what monks, mystics, and contemplatives have been cultivating deliberately for millennia. This convergence between spontaneous near-death experiences and deliberately cultivated spiritual states suggests something important. The silence beyond thought isn't an empty void or a mere absence. It's a fertile ground from which something valuable emerges. When we experience it, whether through crisis or through practice, we often come away with a profound sense that we've touched something real, something true, perhaps something more real and more true than our ordinary understanding of ourselves and our world. The poet T.S. Eliot wrote of the still point of the turning world, a place of silence at the center of all movement, all change. This metaphor captures something essential about what near-death experiencers describe, a profound stillness that paradoxically contains all possibility, all knowledge. Not emptiness, but fullness. Not absence, but presence. Not disconnect, but connection of the most fundamental kind. In the noise of modern life, we rarely experience genuine silence. Our minds continuously generate an endless stream of thoughts, worries about the future, regrets about the past, judgments, plans, and commentaries. This mental chatter has become so constant that we barely notice it anymore. It's the water we swim in, the air we breathe. Yet those who have come close to death often report something remarkable. A profound silence of the mind that doesn't diminish consciousness, but rather enhances it. In that silence, they encounter what many describe as the voice of the soul, a deeper knowing that transcends ordinary thought. These near-death experiences offer us a glimpse into a dimension of consciousness that religions and spiritual traditions have pointed to for millennia. When the thinking mind temporarily steps aside, whether through trauma, contemplative practice, or the brain's response to extreme circumstances, something else emerges. Not unconsciousness, but a different kind of consciousness. Not less awareness, but more. Not confusion, but extraordinary clarity. It's as if the constant narration that accompanies our normal waking consciousness is actually a limitation, a narrow bandwidth that constrains our experience rather than facilitating. Consider what typically happens in a near-death experience. The individual often reports a cessation of fear, a dissolution of ordinary concerns, and most interestingly, a shift in how they know what they know. Rather than piecing together understanding through sequential thoughts, they experience direct, immediate comprehension. Communication with deceased loved ones or spiritual presences happens not through words, but through a direct transfer of meaning. Past events are reviewed not as verbal memories, but as lived experiences, complete with the emotions and perspectives of others involved. It's as if the filters that normally process and narrate experience have been temporarily removed, allowing for a more complete, multidimensional awareness. This quality of consciousness bears a striking resemblance to what contemplative traditions around the world have described as the goal of spiritual practice. Buddhist meditation aims to quiet the chattering mind to reveal the Buddha nature that lies beneath. Christian mystics speak of silencing thought to hear the still, small voice of God. Sufi practices seek to transcend ordinary consciousness, to directly experience divine reality. Across traditions, there emerges a consistent insight. Our ordinary thinking mind, while useful for navigating daily life, may actually obscure a deeper mode of knowing that is always available to us. The journey to this silence isn't about emptying ourselves or becoming blank. It's about discovering what already exists beneath the surface of our thinking, a form of awareness that doesn't need language to know, doesn't need concepts to understand, doesn't need an articulated sense of self to experience being. In this silence, paradoxically, many report feeling more fully themselves than ever before. As one near-death experiencer put it, "For the first time, I knew who I really was, because the voice that had always told me who I was finally shut up." What makes this particularly relevant to our everyday lives is that we don't need to come close to death to experience aspects of this profound mental silence. Contemplative practices that have been developed across cultures offer pathways to temporarily quiet the thinking mind and touch this deeper knowing. Even brief moments of genuine presence, perhaps while walking in nature, during artistic creation, or in moments of authentic connection with another human being, can give us glimpses of what lies beyond our mental narration. These moments often feel more real, more meaningful, more alive than our ordinary states of consciousness. The silence beyond thought isn't empty, it's pregnant with possibility. It isn't void of intelligence. It contains a form of wisdom that our thinking can only approximate. It isn't disconnected, it's where we discover our most fundamental connection. When the mind goes silent, the soul doesn't just whisper. It speaks with a clarity that can transform how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. This isn't merely a spiritual abstraction. It has profound implications for how we live, how we relate to others, and how we face the inevitable challenges of being human. What makes the silence described in near-death experiences so profound is that it's not merely the absence of noise but the presence of something else, something that many describe as more real than what we normally consider reality. Those who have experienced this silence often struggle to put it into words precisely because it transcends the limitations of language. They use metaphors like being embraced by the universe, or dissolving into pure love, or becoming one with everything. These descriptions point to an experience of connection rather than isolation, of wholeness rather than emptiness. Yet most of us have been conditioned to fear silence. We fill our lives with noise, not just external sounds, but internal chatter as well. When we find ourselves alone with our thoughts, many of us quickly reach for distraction. The phone, television, music, conversation, anything to avoid facing that inner void. This avoidance is understandable. In a culture that values productivity, constant stimulation, and clearly defined identity, the prospect of mental silence can seem threatening. What happens to me when the thinking that seems to constitute my selfhood temporarily stops? Who am I without the story I tell myself about who I am? These questions reveal a fundamental anxiety that underlies much of human experience, the fear that beneath our carefully constructed identities lies nothing. That without our thoughts, our memories, our plans and worries, we might simply cease to exist in any meaningful way. This fear drives much of our resistance to silence. We cling to thought not just as a tool, but as a confirmation of our very being. I think, therefore I am, as Descartes famously declared, making thought the foundation of existence itself. But what if this formula has it backwards? What if our truest, most authentic existence doesn't depend on thought at all? What if thought is actually a narrowing of awareness rather than its fulfillment? The testimony of near-death experiencers suggests precisely this, that when thought falls away, something more fundamental remains. Not less than a self, but more. Not the absence of knowing, but a more direct form of knowledge. One man who had a profound near-death experience during heart surgery described it this way. It wasn't that I stopped existing when my thoughts stopped, quite the opposite. Or, the first time, I existed completely, without the endless commentary that had always separated me from direct experience. It was like finally seeing the world without a dirty window between me and reality. This account challenges our assumption that thought is essential to consciousness. It suggests instead that thought may actually function as a kind of filter, useful for specific purposes, but ultimately limiting our perception of a more complete reality. This insight mirrors what contemplative traditions have taught for centuries. Zen Buddhism, for instance, points to a state of consciousness beyond thought called no mind, mushin, which is not unconsciousness but rather consciousness freed from the limitations of conceptual thinking. Christian mysticism speaks of putting on the mind of Christ, a form of knowing that transcends ordinary human thought. Sufi practices aim at fana, or annihilation of the separate self, revealing the direct presence of the divine. These traditions don't devalue thinking. They simply recognize its limitations and point to what lies beyond. The fear of mental silence often manifests as a resistance to meditation or contemplative practices. How many people have tried to meditate only to give up in frustration because I just couldn't stop thinking? This frustration stems from a misunderstanding. The goal isn't to force thought to stop. That approach actually reinforces the dominance of the thinking mind by turning silence into yet another achievement for the ego. Rather, these practices invite us to shift our relationship with thought, to stop identifying so completely with our mental narrative, to create space for another form of awareness to emerge. Near-death experiences offer a powerful insight here, because they represent a spontaneous, uninvited encounter with this other mode of consciousness. People don't will themselves into these experiences. They happen when the ordinary functioning of the brain is compromised. And yet, rather than reporting confusion or diminished awareness, experiencers consistently describe enhanced clarity, deeper understanding, and a more comprehensive grasp of reality. This suggests that our normal brain function might actually constrain consciousness rather than creating it, a perspective that challenges fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mind and brain. How then might we access this profound silence that near-death experiencers encounter spontaneously? Must we face death to taste this deeper consciousness? The good news is that contemplative traditions have developed practices specifically designed to quiet the thinking mind and allow access to this other mode of awareness. These aren't obscure techniques available only to monks in mountain monasteries. They're accessible approaches that can be integrated into everyday life, offering glimpses of what lies beyond our mental chatter. At its most basic, the practice begins with attention to the present moment. Our thinking mind constantly pulls us away from now, into memories of the past, plans for the future, judgments, comparisons, fantasies, and worries. Simply bringing attention back to what's actually happening in this moment, the sensations in the body, the breath moving in and out, the sounds in the environment, begins to create space around our thoughts. We start to notice the difference between direct experience and the narrative about experience, between the world as it is and our interpretation of it. The breath serves as a particularly powerful anchor for this practice because it's always available, always happening in the present moment, and directly connected to our autonomic nervous system. By attending to the breath, not controlling it, just noticing it, we begin to calm the fight or flight response that keeps our minds racing. The breath becomes a bridge between conscious and unconscious processes, between thinking and being. Another approach involves directly observing thoughts themselves, not to analyze or judge them, but simply to notice their nature. Like watching clouds pass across the sky, we can learn to observe thoughts arise, develop, and dissolve without becoming completely identified with them. This metacognitive awareness, the ability to witness our own mental processes, creates a crucial space between the observer and the contents of mind. It's in this space that we begin to recognize that we are not our thoughts. We are the awareness in which thoughts appear. The body offers another pathway to mental silence. Through mindful movement practices like Tai Chi, yoga, or walking, meditation, we can shift attention from abstract thinking to embodied awareness. These practices help integrate mind and body, overcoming the artificial separation that often characterizes our experience. When fully present in the body, the narrative mind naturally becomes quieter, giving way to a more direct, sensorial experience of being alive. Sound can also serve as a gateway to silence, not just external silence, but the deeper silence, beneath thought. Practices involving chant, mantra, or sacred music use sound to transcend ordinary thinking. Through the resonance of voice or the attentive listening to music, the analytical mind can temporarily surrender to a different kind of awareness, one that knows through vibration rather than concept. Nature itself offers perhaps the most accessible pathway to mental silence. Simply being present in natural settings, whether forest, ocean, desert, or mountain, often spontaneously shifts us out of narrative thinking and into direct presence. The complexity, beauty, and aliveness of natural systems can overwhelm our conceptual frameworks, inviting us into a more immediate and participatory relationship with reality. Many people report that in nature, the boundaries between self and world become more permeable, echoing the expanded sense of identity described in near-death experiences. What all these approaches share is a gentle redirection of attention away from abstract thinking and toward direct experience. They don't aim to eliminate thought. That would be both impossible and undesirable. Thinking is a magnificent tool when used appropriately. The goal instead is to develop a more balanced relationship with thought, recognizing it as one mode of knowing rather than the only valid form of consciousness. Those who have experienced profound mental silence whether through near-death experiences or contemplative practice, often report a similar insight, that beneath the surface of our chattering minds lies not emptiness but fullness, not isolation but connection, not confusion but clarity. They describe encountering a form of knowing that feels more authentic, more trustworthy than intellectual analysis, an intuitive wisdom that emerges spontaneously when the thinking mind temporarily steps aside. This wisdom beyond words has profound implications for how we live our everyday lives. When we begin to recognize and trust this deeper knowing, our relationship with ourselves and the world shifts in subtle but significant ways. We become less identified with our thoughts and more rooted in our deeper presence. We react less automatically to triggers and respond more authentically from our core values. We listen more deeply to others, hearing beyond their words to the meaning they're trying to convey. We make decisions not just from logical analysis, but from a more integrated intelligence that includes intuition, embodied knowing, and heart wisdom. Those who have glimpsed this silent wisdom, whether through near-death experiences or contemplative practice, often return with a similar set of insights about what matters most in human life. First among these is the primacy of love, not as an emotion or sentiment, but as a fundamental force that connects all beings. When the narrative mind falls away, what often remains is a profound sense of being part of a loving intelligence that permeates everything. This isn't a philosophical concept, but a directly felt reality. The ground of being itself experienced as inherently loving. Another common insight concerns the nature of time. Our thinking mind creates linear time through its storytelling, past, present, future strung together into a coherent narrative. But in states of mental silence, many report experiencing what might be called a spacious present, a form of temporality where past, present, and future are somehow simultaneously available. This doesn't negate chronological time, but it does suggest that our ordinary experience of temporality is just one way of organizing reality, not an absolute truth. Perhaps most radical is the insight that our fundamental identity transcends the boundaries of our individual selfhood. When the narrating mind temporarily steps aside, the solid sense of being a separate self often dissolves into a more fluid, interconnected way of being. The boundaries between self and other, between perceiver and perceived, become permeable. This isn't experienced as a loss but as an expansion, not becoming less than a self, but more than a self. This insight challenges our culture's emphasis on radical individualism, suggesting that our deepest nature is relational rather than isolated. What's remarkable about these insights is that they arise not from intellectual analysis but from direct experience. They emerge spontaneously when the thinking mind becomes quiet enough to allow a different mode of consciousness to come forward. They don't require belief or faith. They present themselves as self-evident when experienced directly. And they often transform how people live after encountering them, regardless of their prior beliefs or cultural background. The silence beyond thought thus proves to be not an empty void, but a fertile ground from which wisdom naturally emerges. It's as if this wisdom is always available, always broadcasting, but usually drowned out by the noise of our mental activity. When that noise temporarily subsides, whether through crisis, contemplation, or grace, we catch glimpses of what's always been there, waiting to be recognized. This perspective offers a different understanding of what it means to be wise. In our culture, wisdom is often equated with accumulated knowledge, with having thought deeply about things, with intellectual sophistication. But the wisdom that emerges from silence suggests something different. That true wisdom involves knowing when to set aside thinking, when to listen from a deeper place, when to allow understanding to arise rather than constructing it. It suggests that wisdom isn't something we achieve through effort, but something we uncover by clearing away the obstacles to its recognition. The invitation is not to abandon thought, which would be neither possible nor desirable, but to develop a more balanced relationship with it. To recognize thought as a magnificent tool rather than the totality of who we are. To create space for that other voice, the one that speaks not in words but in direct knowing, to be heard alongside our mental commentary. To discover what becomes possible when we periodically set aside the endless doing and planning and analyzing that characterizes modern life and simply rest in being. In the silence that Raymond Moody's research illuminates, the silence encountered at the threshold of death, we find not an ending but a beginning, not unconsciousness but a more complete consciousness, not absence, but presence of the most fundamental kind. This silence calls to us not just in extraordinary moments, but in the midst of ordinary life, in the space between thoughts, in moments of genuine presence, in experiences of beauty or connection that temporarily silence our mental narration. It reminds us that we are more than our thoughts, more than our stories about ourselves, more than the limited identities we've constructed. It invites us to remember what we've always known beneath the noise, that when the mind goes silent, the soul finally has space to speak.